This is Ian Williams. I'm president of the Foreign Press Association in New York, and we're joined today by my old friend and companion, Ron Howell. When I knew him, he was working with Newsday at the United Nations, and we actually went on a trip to Cuba together at a time when very few people got to Cuba with the embargo. We arranged a UN correspondence trip there, and went around the countryside, had some memorable experiences, and rum, and it was memorable in many, many ways. But it was also memorable because Ron been prominent in the Black Journalists Association, been prominent in covering Brooklyn, worked for Newsday, worked for AP, distinguished record as a foreign correspondent in other places. And for many of us, in even a lot of American journalists, I think that Brooklyn and Al Sharpton are a foreign country. So he was reporting from the frontier there. And his biography of Al Sharpton is just finishing it. It was very sort of objective. He's resisted the temptation to lionize Al Sharpton, and has also resisted the temptation to demonize him. But it's not just about Al Sharpton, as Ron explained when I first spoke to him about this. It's about the New York media and the Black media and the white media and how they treated Al Sharpton. And the interesting thing was Al Sharpton, in a way, he's a Black Donald Trump. The media were making fun of him, and he managed to get them to lionize him. He exploited all their weaknesses. He knew uncannily how to get there. There was the old joke about one of the shortest units of time in the universe was the time between a TV camera being switched on and Al Sharpton appearing in its vicinity. And there was some truth in that. But that was the sort of media savvy which many people actually needed in the Black movement at the time. And he spoke up on causes which were unpopular, and some of which, as Ron hints, were not exactly true. The Tawana Bradley case being a case in point, but he was triumphantly vindicated over the Central Park jogger case, for example. So, you know, he's a very mixed bag, and the media, the way they treated him, is extremely important, especially for outsiders who, it's always difficult for those of us who come from other countries to appreciate just how central race is to the American political experience. We've seen an experience of that today when Whoopi Goldberg misspoke, so-called, over the Amnesty International report and other things, and made stuff that for most people in the world would seem like eminently good sense, but obviously offended somebody's sense of theological precision. And then she had to grovel for it. Did she have to grovel? Well, she did. Al Sharpton is not one for groveling, as Ron points out in the book. He's more a case of he subtly slips in quasi-apologies and suggests that maybe it wasn't as clear-cut as he thought at the time. But well, that's a good point for you to come in, Ron. Did he ever apologize when he got it wrong?
Interesting reflection. I appreciate your asking me to be here, Ian. It's a pleasure. You know, over time, just so much you know, fades in the recesses of your memory. Of course, I'll always remember you in our connections at the UN. Has Sharpton ever apologized? It is, being a human being, just a human, of course, there are going to be times when he said, "Oh, I'm sorry about that," referring to something that he may have said a moment ago. But the fact is that apologies do not stand out in one's just sense of his nature. No, and even if you take the Tawana Brawley case, when many people consider that to be slam dunk in the sense of, you know, the point was scored when, well, Les Payne then with Newsday wrote the story, essentially making the case, someone would say without any question that that story was made up, that it was, fabricated. And most of those who went along back then have conceded that, yeah, it was just wrong. It was just wrong. And Reverend Al, to an extent, is surprised me when I started to chat with him over the past years, back and forth, mostly texting. And he did not seem to ever be apologizing for that. He would hedge and say, the closest he would come to it is that those who were advising him, especially Alton Maddox, who he became, distant from over recent years. And, you can see some tensions there between the two of them, and would essentially say, well, whatever I got was from Alton Maddox. And so to the degree that there are apologies to be given, it should be Alton Maddox. But the fact remains that the story, the case, the charges of just fabrication, the character assassination that were filed by those who had been said to have been the rapists by Reverend Al and his partners in that episode, that went to a court in the 1990s, and it was decided against them, and the decision stood. And Reverend Al had to pay money. Of course, he, at that point in his life, paying, even hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, certainly was not that much to him. So by the late 90s, he was, given the association with Donald Trump that you mentioned, rolling in cash might not be the proper word, but, given the realities of America, of Black America, yeah, he's considered, well off, and he paid his due, or others paid for him, but he didn't come out and contest it and say, we're going to take this to the Supreme Court. And just about everyone would say there's no way you could have won if you did that. So for many people, it's the Tawana Brawley episode that stands out, and that, I quoted someone in the Ernest Tollison, who was an editorial writer, editorial page editor with Newsday, and then went to the editorial pages of the New York Times. And he said that's what stands out most for him, that he overcame what you might consider the challenge, the episode of Tawana Brawley, and he really did come through. But there's so much more, really, that.
But he was looking.
Overcome.
In the Central Park jogger case, he was triumphantly vindicated in a way. He was espousing another, what the mainstream media considered to be a hopeless cause with a few alternatives, and he knew the system at least, and he knew that these kids had been set up and disputed. The rest of us, even as dubious ones, tend to give extra credence to police evidence, and he didn't. He knew that the police made things up for various motives, either professional advancement or, racist prejudice. But they made things up regularly, and they forced people to go along with their fictions.
Mm-hmm. But the truth is that there were others too, especially in the Black community, who did not accept the charges against the 5 Black boys who were accused of raping the white woman who was the Central Park jogger. But I do have a scene in the book where, yes, Sharpton is sitting there in court with them. There are a couple of things that you could say that could be seen as a sort of reflection of Reverend Al's nature, character, And one is that it came right after Tawana Brawley, and that he was looking to assert his, credibility with the Black community, especially, who had long felt that Black men accused of victimizing white women sexually stood no chance whatsoever. So in that sense, it was almost a perfect case for Reverend Al to be jumping into. It doesn't seem to me he was always front and center on it. I point out in the book that around that time there was, and this is what stood out, because I do have a chapter on, the racist tendencies of the white media that existed as strongly in the 1980s as they were in the 1950s. And it had to do with the rapes of Black women, the everyday way. And that's why so many people were upset with Tawana Brawley. I mean, there are so many instances of Black women being sexually assaulted. Why pick one that had so many holes in it? And, and it was known for the number of holes that he had in it. But after
that's
the
one of the
center
points you make, isn't it, about the attention lavished on, deservedly, because it was an extremely sad case for the woman involved, of course, but the white banker who was raped, and it makes headlines and runs for months and months. And the sort of weekly score of Black and minority women who are raped and murdered, and they hardly make the police blotter, let alone headlines.
Yes. And I mentioned in the book the case of the Black woman in Brooklyn, who around that very time was raped. And not only raped, but she was pulled onto, she was on a roof and thrown off the roof. And it was Black men, so there wasn't the racial aspect to it, but it was ignored by the media. And the one Black activist who really stood out with that was not Reverend Al, it was Reverend Herbert Daughtry, who's an interesting character because he never came out recently and expressed, certainly not jealousies, but resentment over Reverend Al receiving the attention in this book. Because I think Reverend Daughtry feels that there should be a book about Reverend Daughtry, and with some justification. But of course, he doesn't have the balancing baggage that Reverend Al has that makes him so interesting. But it was Reverend Daughtry who was conducting demonstrations every day about the Black woman who was thrown off the roof. And he even, he would say as he was marching and chanting, and it was picked up by the Amsterdam News. We mentioned the Black press, and they went with it and made the case that, listen, Donald Trump, you're so interested in and willing to take the position of or defense of women who are assaulted. Why not these women? And actually, Trump wound up showing up and apparently contributed some money to her representation, her legal representation. But that's
Donald Trump was anticipating his current form as well, of course, because he paid for a full-page ad calling for the immediate conviction and execution of the Central Park joggers.
Yes,
before the trial.
Yes, and of course that was used, against him. It was such a fascinating time, and then of course the joggers were eventually found to not have carried out that rape, been guilty of it, and it became a movie. But the fact is that this has existed throughout time, especially just the putting aside of Black women. I certainly felt it when I was at the Daily News, and I I point that out. And I mentioned that I was at a bar. I was actually a Harlem bureau chief. They were just establishing the bureau in Harlem, and I was there. And I was out back then. I would have beer. Well, in any event, I would stop at bars.
They were good old days of journalism.
And it was chatting up, with just about everyone there. What better way to learn about the community that you're covering? And they mentioned that one of their barmaids had been killed, murdered, and that they knew who the murderer was, and no one was interested in the case. And it had happened just a couple of days before. And I went to the Daily News right away and said, I have to do this. I have to do this. And what struck me was that there was so little interest in that case.
That was where you mentioned that your photographer wanted to know why he was being sent out on such an inconsequential story.
It was a photographer, and I had learned about it from someone else in the newsroom who spoke with me on the phone and said that they had been, there had been complaints that photographer had to go because there was really nothing to it. I mean, why did a story like that matter? It wasn't someone working on Wall Street who happened to have been white, of course. They wouldn't come out and say that, but that was the, and but I'm proud of myself for having stayed with it, because I did interview the son and learned that the fella who had killed her and beaten her to death with a lamp had been a boyfriend and was angry because she wanted to break up the relationship. And then he just fled, and to its credit, at least the Daily News ran the stories. And I got a call from one of the prosecutors in the Bronx, and one of them said, listen, we don't necessarily cover every nickel and dime murder, but they became embarrassed by the story, and they wound up going after, and they found the killer in, I believe it was Virginia, and brought him back, and he stood trial and was convicted, and I was very proud of that. And it was before Al Sharpton's time, so no way he would have been able to play a role in that. But that's the age we were living in, and in many respects, you could make the case that things have changed, yes, but in a measured way, and it's still true. And people pointed that out regarding sexual assaults and Black women with the case of R. Kelly, the rapper, who had been assaulting Black women all through, the late 90s and early 2000s. And it wasn't until recently, after so much attention, including a book by a journalist whose name I'm not recalling now. And I think I did mention him in the book, as a matter of fact, yeah. And that was brave because he was standing alone, the fellow, and it was a white journalist who wrote that, about R. Kelly, but it eventually accomplished what clearly deep down inside he wanted, just as a moral impulse to happen. And Kelly was arrested and convicted, but just last year. So this is an ongoing thing. And,
but you also mentioned Al and others cheerleading for Mike Tyson on his
yeah, and with the Black community, there's always a tendency or a willingness, you might say, even if it's sometimes a little suppressed, to identify with a Black man who's well known, has overcome challenges himself, and who's accused of could be, improper conduct, criminal conduct. In this case, it was a sexual assault by a Black woman, which is different. And there were many Black women who were very, very upset with Al Tyson for that, and obviously, and they were upset with Al Sharpton and others in the Black community for standing with Mike Tyson, including the editors at the Amsterdam News, who really vilified some of the Black women journalists who went after, including one Black woman journalist who was conducting protests against, and that was Jill Nelson.
Yeah.
Jill Nelson protests against Mike Tyson when he was released. And what some in the Black community wanted to do was say, you know, we welcome Mike Tyson. We don't accept, you know, we think maybe this woman was put up to it, you know, to try to, you know, put him into his place. But
I think that's common amongst
belief that yes, that rape had been, this assault of the Black woman had been committed, and a lot of Black women were very offended, and they were upset with Reverend Al for staying with Mike Tyson on it. But so that's part of the story in the episode too. And Jill Nelson felt that she was very much well abused and still hurt by it. And when we're talking now 25 years later. Yeah, to the point where she didn't, when I tried to talk with her, she didn't really want to have much to say about this topic, the topic of Reverend Al, because of that. Yeah.
Well, beleaguered communities often close ranks. If you know that if 90% of the time accusations are false, then you tend to give the 10% who aren't some credence, which you wouldn't do otherwise. I mean, you can see that with lots of communities. Mm-hmm. I remember the sort of Italian mafia types used to turn up at the UN to defend Italy's case for a Security Council seat. They practically carried the violin cases and put them on the podium. Yeah, because they regarded it as an insult. Italy should be on the Security Council. Why? Because I'm Italian. And, you know, Cosby must be innocent because he's Black and I'm Black. You know, there's a tendency all the way through to close ranks on details like this.
Yes. A marvelous story. You know, I could go on. Well, I guess I will then, if you you know, are fine with me. I see. Don't want to ignore what's in the chat, but you see it. And if there's anything that you need to pass along to me, please do.
Sure, we'll do it right away.
You tell me. In the meantime, you read it while I'm just going on. There are just so many aspects to Reverend Al's story. You know, I had thought at one point that what it might be called as the greatest story ever told. But then again, that's about Jesus Christ and the, you know, and while he's a preacher, yes. And as, you know, many would say, and even in the Black community, yeah, but he's not a true preacher. But the fact is he's a certified and has been, you know, for decades, a certified preacher. And yeah, it is a matter of, you know, truth telling and saying, you know, what drew me to Al Sharpton at the very beginning, and it's necessary to point this out, was that it happened that around the time the Tawana Brawley story was, you know, just happening before it was, you know, revealed and Les Payne's story to be a hoax. I was at Newsday, and because I had a background in Latin America, I had lived in Mexico and was comfortable speaking Spanish, Les Payne was over the foreign desk, had me go to Cuba, and we did a very significant story at that moment, and it was about it was an interview that we arranged with Joanne Chesimard, who known by the name she had adopted, Assata Shakur. She considered herself, and was considered by those, you know, who had been loyal to her, a Black revolutionary, and had been convicted in the 1970s in the killing of a police officer, a state trooper in New Jersey, which she denies to this day, but she was convicted and sentenced to prison. And a group of revolutionaries broke her out of prison. What an incredible tale that was. And no one knew where she was well, I mean, she knew where she was, of course, and there were some, you know, who, of course, who kept it completely to themselves, who knew where she was, but in general, certainly among the public and even the law enforcement community, and I would say the FBI too, intelligence, they did not know until I went there and interviewed her and spent a week with her traveling around Havana, and then came back and wrote a piece about Assata Shakur. And you know, just the changes that, you know, just the fact that she was there in Cuba and the fact that she had survived all these years, because people just wondered what, you know, she was just kind of missing. And it was within the next year that several fellas, and they were all guys, as I recall, approached me and said that, listen, we have strong suspicions that Al Sharpton was approaching us as he did in the early 1980s because he wanted to find out where Assata Shakur was and turn the information over to the FBI. And at first it seemed, you know, very startling. But given that Newsday around that time had been doing stories saying that he had in fact been cooperating with the FBI on a number of things having to do with—
He was wired, he was making, he was tapped, he had his phone wired, he had his briefcase wired, it was all
having to do with Don King, who, you know, talk about, you know, boxing, you know, he was into boxing as a promoter. And so that was my, in a sense, connection, other than just doing a couple of stories, you know, on the ground, helping out in New York City, because as I said, my, you know, real job was, you know, at that point with the foreign desk. You know, there rose a pretty, within the Black radical community, a strong suspicions and hostilities towards Reverend Al. And that was the root, you might say, of my connection to him, including the fact that in 2014, when William Bastone came out with all of this information he had gotten from Freedom of Press, and he had previously also revealed photos of some of the encounters, the FBI, the meetings they had with him in the early 1980s. And it just struck me how kind of fearful, which is so uncharacteristic that Reverend Al looked, you know, in those meetings with the FBI. But I wrote a piece interviewing one of the fellas who was close to Assata Shakur, lying low all the time, but said without a doubt in his mind that Reverend Al was trying to get him to reveal to Sharpton where Assata Shakur was. Now, once again, it's, you know, is part of an amazing story, you know, Reverend Al's rise from, you know, so many, conflicts.
You've sketched it out there. So you had a significant proportion, an influential proportion of the Black community were regarding him as a traitor and a police spy. You had the mainstream white media regarded him as a rabble-rousing buffoon.
Yes, and even the mainstream white media saw him, you know, even though some of them, the police reporters might have, you know, liked the fact that he was working with the FBI, many Americans, you know, would have, especially to capture someone who killed, you know,
allegedly killed.
Yeah, allegedly killed a cop, because she told me, as I said, and you know, I did not investigate it that way, but that you know, that yeah, that was the case. But he you know, wound up surviving all of that, because Newsday did this story. And, you know, I point out in the book that a lot of the reporters on that story, they were Irish Catholics, because that's sort of what defined tabloids, especially the Daily News in Daily News. And it was kind of waning at that point, but it certainly was the case through the mid, you know, 1950s and on into the end of the century, the 20th century. And they were the ones who did blockbuster piece saying that Al was working with the feds and that he had a wiretapped phone in his office. Now that made a lot of people wary, including many who had been marching with him. And then it made many angry, especially those who considered themselves Black revolutionaries. But the incredible thing is the extent to which he has beaten even that, and
well, he's an advisor to Obama. He's an elder statesman, revered and unconsulted and public on occasion. I think even Giuliani's kissed and made up with him, hasn't he? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to tell with Rui.
Yes, I'm not sure I'd want to.
It's been said that he has dementia or whatever. I guess we all have dementia past the age of what? Past the age of 50. But yes, that was true. But the thing is that, and just looking at myself, because I consider the book King Al also to be in part a memoir, and it took others to point that out to me at the beginning. This was, Ron, about yourself and your experiences too. And yes, that was true. I don't know why.
Well, there's so many names I remember working with, from Wayne Barrett, Earl Caldwell, all of the others.
Yes.
Reporters, yes. In the days when reporters met in bars and reported, instead of sitting there quoting tweets and Twitters.
Yes. But this reporter, in a sense, is joined up with Reverend Al in the sense that he cooperated with me on the story. And I was very grateful because I only really had a year to do it, which was, a challenge, and at the beginning I was saying, no, I really can't do this. For one, I didn't really consider it my expertise. I considered my expertise in the political history of Black Brooklyn, because that was my, 2019 book, The Boss of Black Brooklyn, going back into the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. But I said, no, I'm gonna do this. And I think I have the right to do it. And I think I'm qualified to do it. And Reverend Al just worked with me the whole time. There were some steeped in politics in New York, Blacks, who said, yeah, well, he knows that it's to his advantage to do it. And yes, that was true. But I must say I benefited greatly also, even though I knew that the problem was that he, there's too much alliteration. He's so smooth. I mean, Cornel West called Al Sharpton a genius. He said, people don't come out and say that, but he is. He's a genius. And I mentioned it to a Black person who still does not like Al Sharpton a couple of days ago. And he says, no, the word is clever. Not a genius.
Clever like a book.
Clever. But he...
Once again, the
analogy won me over as someone who has overcome such odds, and to have come out of the Black Southern experience as he did and be on the top. He's on the top,
He's host on MSNBC. He's a revered pundit, an advisor to presidents. And, the baggage he's got with him should have sunk in without trace by now.
There was a time when this guy Waldebus, who was a Black state senator, one of the first in Brooklyn, and was from Panama and immigrated in the 60s. So had an experience and background, not the same as Reverend Al's, who was steeped in the, South and, the racism and slavery. That was there. Waldebur Stewart had kind of a conversion. Now, keep in mind, Waldebur Stewart, when I spoke with him 2 years ago doing the book, was in his 80s. But there's something I thought that was worth saying, and for that reason, I ended the introduction, the first chapter with it. And what he said was, well, first of all, he recalled an event in 1969. Al Sharpton was a teenager. He said Al Sharpton appeared and spoke to a gathering at a church in the poverty-stricken neighborhood of Brownsville. Stewart was stunned at the young man's ease with words, and he remembered the speaking talent that stuck in his memory. Stewart left the electoral politics in 1972 to become a college teacher at Medgar Evers College and an activist with the International Methodist Church. And then I quote him, and I thought this quote was a perfect ending to the first chapter and an introduction to the rest of the book, because it almost in a way says everything. He said, "There's no Black man in America now who's more significant than he is," Sharpton said, Stewart said of Sharpton. "Some question things he's done in the past, but those are mistakes that so many, the best and most well-intentioned, make. And the important thing is keeping our character sincere and being upright. He stood next to Barack Obama during Obama's time in office, and he, Sharpton, rose from the ground levels of Brooklyn to the highest seats in the United States of America." And I thought that was well put. And I would add, just to maybe add an element of poetry to it, that Walter Stewart died in last month, January 1st, as a matter of fact. And that, a very touching tribute.
Well, that's, I mean, one of the things, I keep seeing parallels with Donald Trump, except that Al Sharpton is much more intelligent and in many ways well-meaning, but they both had a talent for getting the media attention and for the catchphrase. Al Sharpton much more eloquently and intelligently. But I saw him in 2004 when he was running in the primaries for the president. And if you didn't know his past, he was the most impressive of the candidates I spoke to. He was one of the few who was willing to say what the issues were and address them instead of waffle around them. So, I was impressed with him then, even though I knew about all the dubiety. Hell, it was some of my friends who were doing the exposure on the FPA case. So I was under no illusions, but he was a very impressive figure. And the fact that he's up there at MSNBC, and you almost wonder who's behind him. You begin to think deep state paranoia. We have a question from Simon Locke. What's the lessons from coverage of Al Sharpton for media covering Black leaders today, as well as the Black-owned media? I mean, are people getting a pass, or are they still getting extra harsh scrutiny, and that what would be dismissed as a peccadillo by a white politician is headline news for a Black politician, for example?
I mean, which would have been the case years ago, you're saying, with Reverend Al. It is that it is, it's certainly in the interests of reporters today to have a connection to Reverend Al. And the fact is that so much that did happen receded into our collective memory, and it's the past. And I began to feel a little guilty myself about even raising some of these things, because there were people who were challenging me as I was writing the book for doing it. But the fact is that, and I sometimes wonder what this is all going to lead to with Reverend Al. There are some maybe who be wondering, well, where is the misstep going to come from? When is it going to happen? And how long has it been now? And it has not. So I could not give a definitive answer on whether, although it seems to be a combination of his, let's call it genius, and give Cornel West his due in his characterization of Reverend Al, or the tendency of journalists to kind of go with the flow. I mean, because we saw that happen even in the 1980s when Reverend Al became very close to Mike McAlery, who wrote, he was the first one, he did the story saying that the feds had a bugged phone in Reverend Al's office, and that was in 1988. And
McAlery was your classic Irish mafia type reporter.
Classic. Boy, and he knew the cops, and he was always having breaking stories about in fact, there are some who will say, with some legitimacy, that it was because of Tawana Brawley and McAlery's connection to the police and to law enforcement types, local and federal, that they reached out to him and said, listen, we're gonna put an end to this Al Sharpton, and came out with that FBI story, which made a lot of sense. And there are people at the Village Voice who were at the Village Voice. I don't want to name names, some of them, you know, still around, who will say that you know, I don't know whether, you know, those who worked with Mike would say it. They would concede, I guess, that it was law enforcement types that leaked it to him, but that the goal was to end this guy, you know, just, you know, mouthing off about the Tawana Broly episode once and for all, and his teammates, Alton Maddox and Sean Vernon Mason, that maybe that was the motivation. But in any event, it's clear that it did not happen. But the point I wanted to make about Reverend Al's relationship with McAlery was that they got along very, very well. And after Sharpton got stabbed, who went to the hospital to visit Reverend Al? Mike McAlery. And when McAlery was sick, hospitalized after this serious car accident that he had a couple of years after, Sharpton went to see him and pay his respects. And so I think in some ways that's very typical of the press, you know, sort of courting your sources. And who's a better source now in the Black community than Reverend Al Sharpton, you know, being, you know, at the very top. So I hope that answered some of the question. If Simon Locke wants to, you know, follow up on it, please do, or you tell me, Ian, whether it needs to be, you know, pursued a little bit more. The environment in many ways is the same.
Well, somebody also points out it seems of deja vu all over again. The case in Connecticut with Lawrence Smith Fields and the date, the murder that was ignored for several weeks.
Yes, I mean, that's the whole point, really, you know, and then came up the Me Too movement, which was started by, you know, a Black woman who's based here in Brooklyn, as a matter of fact, you know, all things center on Brooklyn, I like to say, but that's true. That has not changed, I don't believe, and it's pointed out, although it's often challenged now. What's changed so notably in New York City and the country is that, you know, whereas in the 1980s and even 90s, we were seen as a Black and white city and country, it's much more complicated now. And there are so many people who identify as neither. You know, and there was a time if you were biracial but appeared to be white, then you had to, you know, pretend to be white. And then just the explosion in immigration from Latin America, that's just made it. But yes, the abuses of women of color and the ignoring of their plight continues, and it's around the country, and it's here in New York and Connecticut, and that was a very, very sad story. It's you know, hard to believe that it would happen in this day and age, but it did, and it is more likely to happen, of course, in Connecticut than New York City.
I was talking to students recently about Reuben Carter and Hurricane. And we read Hurricane as a poem, the Bob Dylan song. And honestly, you would not think there was an instant between Black Lives Matter now, the situation, and 50 years ago when Reuben Carter was picked up and framed. I mean, as Bob Dylan said, if you're a Black, then you just shouldn't show on the streets at night.
Yeah, and
And the police all across the country were coming in. I don't think it's that the incidents have increased, it's that these incidents are now being, the one small progress, are being reported for the first time instead of being taken for granted. That's just the way things go. That's the Bob Dylan line. And so, has there been progress?
Personally, I was looking at them in the question. I mean, you look at what we have here now in New York City. I would have a hard time saying no, given the leadership, elected leadership in New York City. I mean, I still have this kind of ingrained journalist lack of faith in politicians and elected, and with me, in some respects, it's Freudian, because I grew up in the home of the first Black elected official in Brooklyn, Assemblyman. The Black mayor, public advocate, the attorney general, all of the, I mean, there are more Black elected officials in New York City than I think any locality in
but there are still more Black prisoners in Rikers Island, and there are more.
Yes,
yes.
But you might say that there's hope, and that's what I say, that the Bible says, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. And I always say, no, the greatest of these is hope, because we need a reason to have hope. And there are times I think we can get it from, and this could open up to some heated debate, but with Eric Adams. The thing to keep in mind about Eric Adams is Eric Adams was on the board of the National Action Network. One of the first, in 1991, when Sharpton started the National Action Network. Isn't that incredible in itself? Isn't that, I mean, that's just, and so.
The trajectory, Rudy Giuliani was the mayor, and now he's the national clown and jester.
Yes. What a story. I just couldn't believe it. Sharpton, and I was surprised but pleased and grateful that Sharpton invited me to the that would have been the 30th anniversary gathering at Carnegie Hall of the National Action Network last year. And it was also Reverend Al's 67th birthday that they were celebrating together. I was stunned by being there, and I, at first I was thinking, well, maybe you should promote the book, but that wasn't gonna.
You should always promote your books. It's the law. You should always promote your books. It's the law, because the publishers won't.
No, but I mean, maybe Reverend Al should say something about it, but that wasn't going to happen. I don't know. But to be there, it took my breath away, and, who is this person who came from there, pointing to the past to here? And who gave the opening address via Zoom? Kamala Harris. Live, Kamala Harris. And who was there? Hochul, Tish James, all of the state and local elected officials. And who showed up, and walked up to the stage towards the end? Eric Adams. And believe it or not, it was the night before the general election. The night before the election. And he decides he has to show up. Eric Adams. So what does that say about Al Sharpton's influence and his influence now? As I said, it's a story for the ages. It's a story of our land, of our generation, but it's a story of Black America and coming out of slavery. And Sharpton's background is steeped in slavery, because they come from the South, Alabama and Florida. And as I said, it could be, 700 pages if you wanted to tell the whole tale and go back to.
I'm torn about whether it's more difficult for foreigners coming in here to appreciate the indelible effects of those centuries of experience in the South on the community, or the fact that so many Americans don't get it at all. They don't see there's a separate one. And they say, why are these people holding grudges? You know, these people, why are they still holding grudges? Why can't they let bygones be bygones? And that type of stuff. So you have multiple blindnesses about this, but Al keeps bringing us back to the central experience, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. And, you know, I sometimes said when I approached Reverend Al about it was that what connected me to him was being that we were Black Brooklynized, both of us, born and raised. Reverend Al, several years younger. But that was very meaningful to me. And I walk around Brooklyn now and I see, even though I've traveled around, I've lived around, but Black Brooklyn is still in me. And I see guys, you know, I walk towards Prospect Park and see Black guys pulling down their pants to defecate. And I almost want to break out in tears. And you see it in the subways. And it's just there, and it's clear that it's a continuation of and talking to themselves and shouting out, and it's related to so many things, and it's related to, you know, Rikers Island, and it's related to the disparities that we see in education, everything, and they have to come to grips with it. And the hope is that by controlling, you know, the Department of Education and having a deep sensitivity to all that, that I'm expecting, again, hoping that Eric Adams, together with Sharpton and others, do, that there's going to be, at least soon, a visible modicum of change. There's something I wanted to say before I departed, and we are approaching.
Yes, we're getting closer.
Yeah, was that there's kind of a bifurcation there. I mean, I identify as an offspring of Caribbean immigrants from the British West Indies. In my book about Bertram Baker, the boss of Black Brooklyn, he came from Nevis and he immigrated here as a British citizen. And he spoke like a Brit, you know. He went to, you know, private school, St. Kitts and Nevis. And I, in the last 20 years, became a citizen of St. Kitts and Nevis to hold on to some family property. But the experiences were, in some ways, were very, very different. And the first Black elected officials disproportionately were from the West Indies. A lot of
the Black businessmen, successful business people.
Yes, realtors
from the West Indies.
Brooklyn were from Barbados. That is the island that really stood out. But I came up when there was starting to be kind of a merger, because the migration from the South really intensified in the 50s and 60s. And that's when Sharpton's parents came. And I think of my best friends that I grew up with and who were from the South. And in some ways it was new to me because my grandparents, who I grew up with my grandfather, who was from Nevis, and my grandmother, who was born in Brooklyn 1901, but two immigrants from Nevis, and they very much identified as former British. But I came to as a Black American, and there's been a book. Mary Waters, her name is, a Harvard professor who's white, and said that's the difference between the offspring of Black immigrants and the offspring of the Italians and the Irish, especially Irish. The offspring of the Irish became president of the United States. She said the offspring of the Black immigrants become Black Americans, with all the baggage that carries. And I just think of my friends who wound up addicted to heroin and killed, murdered at an early age. And to that extent, I identified with Reverend Al, and I think he understood that about me. And that was one of the reasons, I hope, in addition to his, you know, ability just to partner with the press, but that connected us, that Black Brooklyn connection.
Well, I think you really pulled it together in those last few statements, you know, as white working class British who was always treated as a suspicious because I had a Liverpool accent when I went to London. A similar but nowhere near as intense experience. But thank you, everyone. This is Ian Williams from the Foreign Press Association. I've been talking to Ron Howell, who has been eloquently explaining why we neglect Al Sharpton at our peril and history. And yes, he might be a sort of separated at birth from Donald Trump, but he's a much nicer version of it. And following on the same train, in fact, we have tentatively booked, we haven't got the date yet, for the editor of Amsterdam News to come on. And Ellie Tatum, it's one of the surviving, in fact, you could almost say there's one of the surviving press, because there's not that many newspapers left, but a surviving Black newspaper, it's in double jeopardy. And she's agreed to come on, we're doing that. And then, as they said, there's a British television program, and now for something completely different. Next Thursday, the same time, we have none other than John Bolton explaining his views on Eastern Europe and Biden. And once again, a person who's often neglected, but has got considerable depth, which doesn't mean to say you have to agree with him, but it's the same as with Al Sharpton.
I wanted to say before I left that he wouldn't remember me, but he was in my class in college at Yale, a class of 1970. John Bolton. Yeah.
Oh, well, he's...
Leave it at that.
Well, he's, once again, I think he is a working class kid made good. You know, he was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He's tried hard to put one in it since, perhaps, but he didn't start off with it, like you and me. So thank you very much, everybody. This is Ian Williams again, Foreign Press Association. Next Thursday, we have John Bolton. Later in the week, we have Ellie Tatum from the Amsterdam News. And of course, all of the time we have these programs, we invite you to join the Foreign Press Association. You can find the details, or almost as good, and we invite you to donate to help our work as we come out of the COVID period, like everybody else, attenuated and wondering where the hell we've been for 2 years. So thanks very much. I hope to see you soon in one of these bars in Harlem, Ron, since I'm up here.
Oh my goodness. I give up.
We're due for drinks. You did? Oh, well, that's a mistake. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah.